Okay, vi skal til at starte igen. Og nu kører vi bare, så må I til at komme ned og sidde og dæmpe jer lidt. Vi har 2 praktiske bemærkninger nu. Den ene er meget praktisk. Det er, at hvis I vil have en mulighed for at komme hurtigt hjem i bil, så kan det være nyttigt at betale for parkeringen. Her for eksempel i frokostpausen, det kan man godt, fordi klokken 4, der vil der erfaringsmæssigt være en kø nede omkring parkeringen. Den anden er mulighed for at stille spørgsmål. Der er nogle af jer, der har været lidt usikre på, hvordan vi gør, og det er jo blandt andet, fordi I er vant til, at man får en mikrofon, rejser sig op og stiller et spørgsmål. Det gør man ikke i år, fordi ved at samle spørgsmål sammen, har vi en bedre mulighed for at komme igennem så mange som muligt, styre tiden og andet. Og vi ved også, at mange af jer, der brænder ind med de bedste spørgsmål, naturligt er lidt tilbageholdende med at rejse op foran 500-600 mennesker. Det I kan gøre i stedet for, det er at tage SKAGEN-blokken, skrive spørgsmål ned og give den til en af vores ansatte. Og det skal I så gøre under præsentationen. I skal ikke gøre det bagefter. De samler sammen og bringer os op til os her på første række, der gør vores bedste for at holde styr på det. Det betyder også, at I behøver ikke at være helt så skarpe på at formulere et spørgsmål, akkurat som om I var trænet tv-værter eller andet. Hvis I indikerer, hvad det er, I synes måske på emnebasis, så skal vi nok sørge for, at det også fungerer rimelig heroppe. Så hvis noget der optager jer noget, I synes, vi skal have fat i, så skriv det på papiret, marker til en af de SKAGEN-ansatte, op med lappen så, de er jo ikke tankelæsere, op med lappen, og så skal vi få sat det i sving. Og jeg tror og forventer, at især i eftermiddag bliver der også basis for rigtig mange gode spørgsmål. Godt, husk det nu. Jeg vil så kort introducere vores næste speaker. Torgeir Høien is portfolio manager at the SKAGEN Global Fund, SKAGEN Tellus. Tellus means globe in Latin. He's a macroeconomist from University of Oslo. He has worked on the as board member of the Norwegian Central Bank, Norges Bank. It's an institution with a rather big amount of money, as you know. He'd been senior economist at Handelsbanken, and he has been with SKAGEN since 2005. He fulfills a dual function with us. He's portfolio manager, of course, and he's also, in many ways, our chief economist, as you will learn pretty soon. In the management of SKAGEN Tellus, he uses his academic background to put to work into actual bond management. The fund has delivered since 2006 an annual return in Danish kroner of 5.2% versus an index return of 3.6%. So it's a significant outperformance, and we're talking bonds here. We're not talking equities at large. The fund has an unconstrained mandate. It means duration can be both low and high. And it works with excessive currency movements across the globe and continually monitors inflation and real interest rates around the world. As you will see, all this is the basis of presentation now. So please welcome Torgeir Høien.
Hi. Oh my God, talking after a Nobel laureate and a Hayek Lifetime Achievement recipient. The only thing I got as a medal was a bronze medal in grade school, cross-country skiing. And being from egalitarian Norway, of course, everybody got a bronze medal, if you don't. Even the Angela Merkels in our class got bronze medals for cross-country skiing. I'm going to praise debt. Being a bond investor, I had to say something good about bonds. And I will do that. Unfortunately, but first, I forgot my pen. Brian, can I borrow a pen from you? Thank you. Unfortunately, debt has become a four-letter word. This is the total debt in the US. And I've added up everything. You know, household debt, business debt, government debt. You read a lot in the press about debt levels being too high. And I think that is too superficial. I just increased the debt in Denmark. Brian, I borrowed his pen. No statisticians will record it. But in fact, it's a loan. And nobody is hurt if I don't miss it. You will get it back. I do think that we need to look with a clearer head on debt and distinguish between good debt and bad debt. It's for a reason that poor countries have little debt and rich countries have a huge amount of debt. How come? Because debt depends upon clear property rights. You own this pen, you'll get it back. It depends upon trust. You have trust in me that I will in fact give it back to you. What poor countries lack is clear property rights, free markets, and a general high level of trust among people. What rich countries have are clear property rights, free markets, and generally a high level of trust. So then, of course, you are willing to lend your resources to other people who might use them more productively than you yourself. And you get a part of the return. So, debt is generated by trust and also by optimism. Because you want, indeed, a return on your investment. So talking about there being too much debt is in a way as silly as talking about there being too many stocks. Okay? Debt is one form of financing companies. Equity is another form of financing companies. Of course, some people waste resources. I might drop this. His loss. Greece had too much debt. Detroit had too much debt. A lot of companies have too much debt. Some companies have too little debt. Okay? Some governments have too little debt. So it all depends. And we should look carefully. And that's what I do when I select bonds for my portfolio. Okay? So I'm not afraid of debt at all. It's part and parcel of economic growth. And we should just be careful about what kind of debt that we invest in. Is there too much government debt? Again, we have to be clear. The headline says that Japan has a debt level of 240% of GDP. But that doesn't take into account the vast amount of assets that is owned by the Japanese government. And you need to take that into account. They have huge foreign exchange reserves owned by the Bank of Japan and so forth. So, subtracting that, you get a net debt level of 140%. Too much debt in the UK, in the Eurozone, in the US? Well, I'm not so sure. It all depends. In some Eurozone countries, there were indeed too much debt. Okay? But overall, I don't think that the debt situation is that alarming as a lot of people claim. It all depends upon the ability to service the debt. And how do you service the debt? You service the debt by promising to deliver a positive primary surplus. A primary surplus is surplus before interest payment. Okay? So, in my fund, I'm staying out of Japan. Not because of the debt level, but because they don't seem able to generate a positive primary surplus for the foreseeable future. And there is the definitive risk that they cannot honor the debt. That will not result in a Greek default, but it might result in high inflation in Japan. Mr. Shinzo Abe is praying for more inflation. And amazingly, the gods have answered him so far. Inflation currently is about 1%. He's praying for 2%. I'm afraid that Mr. Shinzo Abe might get a lot more inflation than what he's praying for, if he doesn't fix the fiscal situation. In the US, the situation is radically different. I mean, these are the numbers from the IMF. They came out in October, and they're already passé. The primary balance in the US is about to close in on zero. They've had a dramatic increase in tax revenues and some modesty when it comes to growth in public expenditures. So, in the third quarter, the primary deficit in the US was less than -2%. In the Eurozone, they have almost a primary surplus. In the Eurozone as a whole, public finances isn't that much of a problem. The problem, as Paul Krugman said too, is that you have a Eurozone, a common currency, but you don't have a fiscal union. They don't have a fiscal union. I'm sorry, Denmark. You have your own name of the euro called krona. In the Eurozone, they don't have a fiscal union, okay? And without a fiscal union, it's very, very difficult to handle problems because you don't have fiscal transfers from rich countries to poor countries, or rather from rich governments to poor governments. So that's why everybody, almost, among economists, was worried about the Eurozone. How come that you can have a common currency without a common fiscal policy? And some historians said, oh, we had a Scandinavian common currency union. But what was the common currency? It was gold, okay? Gold. Their common currency is a kind of government debt. Debt issued by the ECB, okay? The significance of what Mr. Draghi said in London about a year and a half ago, when he said, we will do whatever it takes, is that he implicitly said that we will, in Frankfurt, act as the fiscal authority of the Eurozone to keep the Eurozone intact by using our own balance sheet. Okay? That is a fiscal union under the radar. Okay? And that's what the market has taken to their heart, and it might help. Primary surpluses depends upon political sobriety. That means politicians need to, well, they're talking about austerity, but except for a few countries, you have hardly seen any cuts in nominal spending. What you have seen is a slowdown in public spending, okay? They're spending less than they expected to spend, but they are almost in every country spending more than the year before, with some few exceptions. So you need political sobriety, but most of all, you need economic growth. Because revenues from tax bases are the real crucial thing when it comes to generating public surpluses. That's why public finances have recovered in the US. That's why I think that the fiscal situation in the Eurozone too will become much better over the next year, because you will see a turnaround in economic growth in the Eurozone, and that will generate more tax revenues. But look at Japan. Japan, I mean, I said that I'm afraid that Japan might be heading for too high inflation. Too high inflation is the way to solve a public debt problem if you have your own currency. You just devalue the real value of the debt, okay? But Japan, amazingly, in GDP per capita terms, has had more growth since before the financial crisis than the Eurozone. Okay? The Japanese are indeed different from us. Their sexual life are not that, active. They are in fact, they have very few babies, and they have a lot of elderlies. Okay, so they do have some problem. This is adjusted for demographics. Okay, but in per capita terms, growth hasn't been that poor in Japan as we sometimes think, even going back before the financial crisis. Well, Paul Krugman mentioned this. Larry Summers gave a very high-profile speech at an IMF meeting a month or two ago, arguing that not only are we not out of the Great Recession yet, but we might be heading for a period of secular stagnation, meaning we might be heading for a period of subpar growth that will not end in the foreseeable future. There's one famous Danish-born economist called Alvin Hansen. Okay, well, his parents were Danish. He came to America as a young guy. He became a professor at Harvard. He became the first Keynesian, high-profile Keynesian in the US. And he made a very, very wrong mistake in 1939. He said, not just are we not yet out of the Great Depression, but we are heading for a long period of secular stagnation. We might have a bubble. Well, we got a bubble. World War II, okay? Blew up public expenditures in the US, brought in women in the workforce, and you saw a sharp rise in GDP. But what he said was that there's a lack of investment opportunities. Demographics is against us. So we're heading for a period of secular stagnation. After the war, we will see a new depression, and then, it will just be a flat, boring period. And of course, he was dead wrong. He was dead wrong on two accounts. If you look at the official statistics, there was indeed a contraction in GDP in 1946 because all the women went home, okay? And the soldiers came home, and public expenditures, airplanes, bombing, whatever, which counts as productive activities in national accounts were halted. So you had a contraction in GDP, but there was no recession. It was a period of peace and prosperity, and it lasted for 20 many years, okay? So he was wrong. Will Larry Summers be proven wrong too? I mean, his arguments might be a bit different, but in fact, he's from Harvard too. I mean, there must be something about the social network in Harvard, huh? Okay. He too is advocating now the idea that we're in for a period of secular stagnation. And my inclination is to think that he is as wrong as Alvin Hansen is dead. But you could argue that he has a point. I mean, this is Peter Thiel, you know, the guy behind PayPal, the guy who first invested in Facebook. He's a brilliant entrepreneur. We wanted flying cars. I just saw this brilliant movie from the early 80s about free will, really, called Back to the Future with my kids. It's a brilliant movie. And they went ahead of time, you know, to 2012. And what they had then, of course, was flying cars. So we never got flying cars. Instead, we got Twitter, okay? So there is this idea that, you know, all kinds of gadgets and so forth, I mean, it's nice to have, but it's not enhancing productivity on a large scale, okay? That's a widespread attitude among businessmen and also among economists. And if you look at economists and historians, I mean, you can go way back before Alvin Hansen, back to Malthus, okay? And there's a long history of pessimists among economists that, you know, everything that can be invented has been invented, and nothing new is going to happen. And I just think that shows the lack of imagination in an economic mind, a macroeconomic mind. I do think that we will see a lot of new inventions. I think, for once, that, you know, there might be problems with globalization, but from now on, think about this. There's a huge amount of kids going to very good schools in India, in China. They will soon have research universities on the scale of Stanford and so forth. So you will see Silicon Valleys in East Asia, in India, in Africa too. Of course, I mean, they are as brainy as us, and they will come up with new ideas. And these ideas we can pick from them and implement in new technology and produce more goods. Indeed, if you look at economic efficiency, which is the ability to turn out goods and services for a given amount of capital and labor, there was indeed a slowdown, of course, during the Great Recession. But then you have seen an uptick. This is in the US. You can see the same numbers in a lot of countries. Even in Denmark. I mean, they are very slow in producing statistics in Denmark. So I couldn't put out those numbers because we only have numbers for 2011. But in Norway and a lot of other countries, you'll see a clear uptick in economic efficiency over the last year and a half too. Okay? But look at the this is on a logarithmic scale. So this means a straight line is, you know, equal growth per year. You know that? Look at what has happened in the US before. Okay, this is after Alvin Hansen's projections. You had a huge increase in economic efficiency. that really lifted the American economy. But then, about 1965, when, well, I'm a libertarian. Well, SKAGEN is not, but I'm a libertarian. So I might say that the slowdown in productivity growth, it just began when Lyndon Johnson began to build up the welfare state in the US. That's probably just a coincidence. In 1965, you saw a markedly reduction in the annual rate of growth in economic efficiency. Economists call this total factor productivity. And it lasted until Monica Lewinsky, about. And then it picked up again, and you had very rapid growth during the 90s. And a slip, and currently we are back on trend. Trend growth in economic efficiency is 1.2% per year for the whole period, including the great productivity slowdown in the 70s, and also the high productivity growth of the 90s. So I'm not that worried about a sustained slowdown in economic growth, because what's really driving growth is not demand. It's not shopping. It's not the woman or the man who goes to the shopping mall who drives the economy. It's the guy who built the shopping mall, the workers who work at the shopping mall who drives the economy. Okay? I mean, there's all too much, in my view, a tendency to focus on demand. When people talk about China, they say that even reasonable economists say that China should change its growth model and shouldn't rely on investment. It should rely on consumption. What consumption hasn't driven growth anywhere. Consumption is the result of growth. If you have growth, you can have a consumption. And consumption in China has in fact increased by 8% per year over the last 30 years. Because GDP has increased by 10% per year over the same period. Okay? So we really need, for the long run, at least, to focus on the supply side of the economy and not have a hang-up on the demand side. I'm not saying that of course, we might have demand-side problems, but those are short-run problems. Speaking about technology, what is this? It's not from my backyard. It's not my kids' plaything. It's a drone, commercial drone, used by farmers in the US. It's still not legal. I mean, it's very good that they didn't invent cars, automobiles now. Because, I mean, you would have a hell of a problem getting them approved by bureaucrats and politicians. In Norway, no way they would allow cars in Norway. They will pollute it. People are killed. So, but drones, I mean, used by the military until recently to kill terrorists and innocents. Okay? Now they are using them commercially. China has said that we will be the first one to open up for the possibility of using drones commercially. And you're thinking about, how this is going to happen, and we're going to drop things in my garden, whatever. I mean, well, it will be fixed. They were able to build post box offices and so forth, and they will find ways to use this. And of course, also we have driverless cars, which is good because then your wife don't have to go shopping. I mean, it will cut down. You just send the car. So, but the argument from Mr. Summers, and there is some validity to this argument, indeed, in the short run. This is the only macroeconomic kind of figure that I'm going to show you. I mean, theoretical. I mean, it's planned investment, which is a function of the real interest rate. Okay? The less interest rate, the more people invest. Planned saving, the higher rate of return you expect, the more you save. Okay? So where is the equilibrium? Okay? And that's the argument from Paul Krugman and from many. And I bought into that argument too, myself. I'm still, when it comes to the recession itself, that the actual equilibrium rate of interest is below the floor. The floor is determined by the zero lower bound on the policy rate and expected inflation. This is real interest rate. So if you have zero policy rate and expect 2% inflation, the real rate is minus 2%. But the economy might indeed need minus 3 or 4% to clear the markets for loanable funds. So that might indeed have been a huge problem during the recession. It might linger on. But I do not think that this will be the situation for the foreseeable future. Because I do think that planned investment will move to the right due to new technologies and so forth. And I do think also that with growth, people will spend more, save less, and thereby shift that order curve to the left, making it much easier to be Janet Yellen and Mario Draghi. Because then they don't have this floor to think about. A policy rate of 0 is enough. The argument really, and you hear that a lot in the press and by commentators and by economists, that somebody out there is saving all too much. And it's amazing to me that nobody has mentioned Norway yet. I mean, these are absolute numbers. Absolute numbers. These are not per capita. I mean, people blamed China for saving all too much. Okay? They're investing a lot, but they're saving even more. And this extra saving is causing the market, the equilibrium rate of interest to be too low. And now people are pointing at Germany as the great villain. The Germans should shop more and save less. And that would save the Eurozone and help the world. Another name for this is the current account surplus. Okay? Norway has the mother of all current account surpluses. In per capita terms, we're off the chart. Talk to a Norwegian Keynesian economist, and he would have 100 reasons why this is perfectly reasonable. Talk to him about Germany and China, and he would say, oh, they are saving all too much. Yeah, I've been sitting on the central bank board of Norges Bank, and in the official publications, we always complained about the so-called imbalances in the world. China is saving too much, and so forth. And I said, but what about us? Aren't we saving too much? So, and it's kind of ridiculous too, because Angela Merkel has a lot of power, but she cannot decide the current account balance of Germany. The current account balance of Germany is determined by 85 million people taking decisions on their own. In Norway, maybe you could do something because it's mainly the state who saves. By the way, they don't get that much of a return. Our accumulated net assets on the rest of the world is much higher than our annual GDP. But the investment income is barely about zero. If it wasn't for SKAGEN funds, it would be below zero. And I've done the numbers, believe me. Okay, but look at this. Risk-free long-term real interest rates has risen. They have risen recently. Why have they risen? I do think that what has been happening here is that people are seeing, markets are seeing that the global economy is doing better. We should all pray for higher risk-free real interest rates because they are a symptom of more capital expenditures, more optimism, more trust, and so forth. 2 minutes to go. Okay. 2 minutes to explain why. This is another old guy. He has a nice bird. Irving Fisher, he told us that expected inflation is nominal interest rate minus the real interest rate. And now 2 minutes to explain something that almost everybody disagrees with me about. 5 minutes, okay. What happens, think about this. What happens, Janet Yellen, okay, she's taking over 1st of February. Janet Yellen, Mario Draghi, and so forth, they promise, honest to God, we will keep the policy rate at zero until the end of times, or at least 2017. Okay? What happens? What happens if the nominal interest rate is kept at or close to zero? What happens if the economy is expanding and the real interest rate is getting higher, determined by the real economy? In the long run, everybody knows that a central banker cannot control real economic variables. So what happens? Well, expected inflation has to fall. This might be happening as we speak. Look at this. Consumer prices, expected inflation also influences actual inflation. Plus, actual inflation is, of course, influenced by interest rate payments from the government. So, a very, very loose monetary policy, meaning zero interest policy, means that government interest expenditures are becoming lower and lower and lower. Okay? So you could argue that in the long run, expansionary fiscal policy means a tighter, expansionary monetary policy means a tighter fiscal policy. Do you follow me? Okay? Less money into the pockets of households and so forth. Look at this. This is from a year, and there came new numbers from the Eurozone just the other day. I mean, core inflation in the Eurozone is 0.7%. Core inflation in the US is barely above 1%. Amazingly, Japan is the winner in the inflation competition over the last year. And I am a bit amazed. I am a bit amazed about the power of Abenomics. To just talk and talk and talk and buy some bonds, government bonds, and to bring up inflation a bit. And I'm a bit worried about, is this just a blip? We have seen this before. I mean, they haven't had deflation for a generation. But I'm more worried, is this the beginning of high inflation in Japan due to too much debt? It's way too early to tell. I might be surprised that they, in fact, get 2%. I predict, I will end with a prediction. And that's why I'm not worried about long-term nominal interest rates, because they have risen already during last year. Okay? In the US, The 10-year treasury yield is about 3%. What will happen, I think, over this year is a further rise in real interest rates, but a fall in expected inflation. And those two effects, I think, will about cancel each other, meaning that nominal interest rates are going to stay about where they are now. And this gives me a lot of opportunities to buy bonds all over the world, because it's much less risky to buy bonds with a spread when the sea level itself is not anticipated to go up a lot. So I expect 2014 to be a good year for the global economy and a good year for SKAGEN Tellus. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Torgeir, for an engaging speech. At this point in time, we should probably mention that economic debate in US and other places, there are an equal amount of strong economists who fight your corner and who fight with Paul Krugman. Now, Paul Krugman had a little more time today to elaborate on his views, but you took on a strong challenge to some of the things he says. So thanks for that. Now, to Paul Krugman, whom we all enjoyed, austerity is an exploited word. He simply doesn't like the word austerity very much. Is it a good word for you or equally bad?
Well, I think that austerity is good if it's about slowing down public expenditure growth and also in some countries cutting public expenditures. We should have much more austerity in Norway. I mean, public expenditures in Norway are growing much higher than GDP. And so they should have slowed down the growth at least. What's wrong about austerity, and there I completely agree with Paul Krugman and others, is that you shouldn't increase tax rates when the economy is depressed. And I think the worst sinner in Europe is Mr. Hollande in France. Because they have barely cut the growth of public expenditures. And they have increased tax rates. Increasing tax rates demotivate labor, demotivate entrepreneurship, demotivate saving, demotivate investment. And the French economy is the biggest question mark in the Eurozone, in my view. And also, if you look at the activity indicators, I mean, they're not good. So austerity, it's too big an umbrella. You have to be specific. Are you talking about tax rates or are you talking about public expenditures? You might even talk about different kind of public expenditures. I mean, investing in infrastructure, investing in schools and hospitals might be a good thing. Using public expenditures as they do in Norway, I mean, my previous speaker referred to Angela Merkel's remark. If you included Norway, you would be up there in the 100%. Norway, let me end. Norway is in this remarkable situation that due to the oil income, a majority of Norwegians, a majority of voters are either employed by the government or are living off grants for the government. So we have a new government in Norway. It's called a blue government, but it's same, different wrapping. Excuse me, I know I have some colleagues who are very much in favor of the new government. In my view, there is very little difference when it comes to politics. That's because the median voter in Norway is hugely in favor of the welfare state. And that is a problem also in Europe as large. I mean, we have built up a welfare state, and it's very, very difficult to cut public expenditures, meaning subsidies, grants for the disabled, or whatever, you know.
Thank you, Torgeir. I must say, as a Dane, it's just completely unusual to meet someone from Norway who doesn't say, "Vi er verdens bedste." And that could be either be economics, how to run a state, or even how to do cross-country skiing. We'll cut back a bit on questions. I'll say thanks for now, and thanks for a really good presentation.
Thank you.